Hi everyone, welcome to Craft Club. I'm Luna.
Hey, I'm Sarah.
And today we're going to be showing you some basic techniques of stretch sewing. We're going to be showing you how to make these bather bottoms from this commercial pattern that we picked up.
And I'm going to show you how to set up your sewing machine and your overlocker ready to do some stretch sewing.
We're going to be showing you all the steps from start to finish and also showing you some handy stretch sewing tips along the way.
Awesome.
Great, let's go. Okay, so now I'm going to show you everything you need for today's tutorial. So I've got my commercial pattern. I just picked one of these up from a fabric store. You can also get great patterns online if you do a search, and also the op shop is always a good place to find a pattern. So I've got my stretch needles for both the overlocker and the sewing machine. Nice pair of sharp fabric scissors, a little pair of snips, a tape measure for measuring myself, some pins, some nice thin elastic for doing the leg bands. And I've got 4 individually coloured threads for the overlocker, and that way the stitching will be really obvious to see on film. Sewing machine, overlocker, and then I've got a couple of different colours of lycra here, and want to make sure that you use a nice good 4-way stretch. So you want it to be able to stretch both ways. You can use lycra, you can use spandex, you can also use a cotton lycra as long as it's got a nice stretch to it. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so this is the commercial pattern that I've chosen for today's tutorial. So we're going to be making these bather bottoms just here. So if you turn over your pattern, and this generally goes on all patterns, there'll be a size chart at the back. So I've measured my bust, waist, hips and back waist, and I've worked out that I am the large size. So when I go to cut out my pattern, I'm going to cut out the large. Okay, so now I'm ready to cut out my pattern. So you've got 2 options with these types of patterns. You can either trace this pattern directly onto paper, and that way if you ever want to cut out or use any of the other sizes, you can in the future. Or if you know that you're only ever going to use one size, then you just cut out one size. So I've decided that I'm going to trace mine in case I ever want to use this pattern again to make other sizes. So the first thing I'm going to do is get my paper scissors, and I'm just going to roughly cut out around the pattern. I'm cutting out the front view of the pattern. So I'm just going to rough cut it first, and then I'm going to trace it on. Okay, so I'm ready to trace my pattern now. I've got my back piece, front piece, waistband. So the first thing I'm going to do is all of these patterns are cut on the fold. So I'm going to line up my center back fold seam with the edge of this paper, which makes it nice and easy. And I'm actually just going to use my thread as a nice pattern weight. You can use whatever you like, whatever's easier. And then I'm going to do a technique with a pin. Got a little pin here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the pin. I've got some nice thick card here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stab the pin along the line of the large pattern, which is what I've chosen to do, through the pattern. And I'm just poking little stab marks with my pin along the large seam line. And so then what will happen is when I fold back my pattern, I'll have a really obvious line of the large pattern on this paper, and then I'll be able to get a ruler and a pen and have my large pattern traced onto this paper. And that's a really great technique, so then you don't have to cut this pattern and then you've saved all your sizes. Okay, so now I've cut out my pattern pieces. So I've got my front piece, my back piece. There was no need to trace off the waistband, so I've actually just used the one from the original pattern. So now I'm going to mark all my information onto my pattern pieces, so when I go to use them again in the future, it all makes total sense. So I'm going to make sure I mark here to cut on the fold. I'm also going to make a note of what this is. So front, bottom. I'm also going to make sure I mark what size. It's a large. And that's so when I go to use them in the future, I've got all my information there. Okay, so now I'm ready to cut out my bather bottoms. I'm going to do the back piece in this bright pink, the front piece in the yellow, and then all my bands in the black. So remember, we're cutting our pieces on the fold. So I've folded my pink fabric in half, made sure there's no wrinkles, nice and smooth. And so I'm lining this seam up here. And then I'm just going to pop some pins in. All right, so now I'm ready to cut out. I'm going to pin around my pattern, cut each piece out.
Okay, so now I'm ready to set up my overlocker to sew my stretch garment. I've already put the stretch needles in. This is a really important step, which is going to make your sewing experience so much easier. And then I'm going to transition from the pink thread that's already in the overlocker and change over to the threads I want to use today. So I'm going to show you a really easy technique, which means you just snip off the threads that are already set up. And then what I'm going to do is tie off my next threads with a nice tight small little knot. Snip the tail off, and then I'm going to go along and do that for each one. Okay, so all my threads are transferred over with a nice tight little knot on each one. And now the next step is to turn your tension dials down to 0. So each one goes back to 0, which means that the knot isn't going to get snagged in the tension as you pull the new threads through. All right, so we've got all the tension set to 0, and next we're going to pull all our threads through. So first of all, I'm going to start by taking the 2 threads that run through the needles. I'm going to very gently pull them, keep pulling until both knots are here just above the needle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip the threads, snip the old threads, and then I'm going to thread the eye of the needle. All right, so I've managed to thread both the eyes of the needle with the blue and the purple thread. So next I'm going to be pulling through the upper and lower thread loops, and to do that I'm going to hold on to the tail of my overlocking thread, and I'm just going to very gently run the overlocker. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull it through. I'm going to wait for the knots to travel all the way through. There they go. All right. And there's the other one. So now what I've got is a beautiful multicolored thread tail, and all my threads are being pulled through. The final step now is I'm going to turn all my tension dials back to 3. 3, 3, 3, 3, and 3 on my stitch length on the side. 3 is a really good tension for stretch sewing. It gives a little bit of stretch, and it's also the perfect tension for the weight of the fabric we're sewing. So I'm just going to do a little practice and make sure that it's sewing well. Yeah, make sure they're set beautiful. That's looking really good to me. Excellent. Alrighty, I'm very happy with this sample. It's got a beautiful amount of stretch in it. Now, when you're learning to sew, it's really awesome to choose 4 different color threads so that you can really isolate each different thread. So the purple and the blue is a stitch. The green is my upper looper, and then the purple is the lower looper. So if anything goes wrong, you can go, oh, it's the lower loopers jumping. I'm gonna fix the tension or have a play with the purple thread. All right, so now I'm going to help you get your sewing machine set up, and this is for anyone that doesn't own an overlocker. That shouldn't hold you back from doing stretch sewing, because I'm going to show you how to do the right stitch length and width with a zigzag, which will provide the stretch. So we just need a sewing machine. Once again, we've got our stretch needles, which is very important. So I'm going to pop my stretch needle in the machine now. And then I'm going to show you how to set up the correct stitch length and width. Okay, so I've created a little sample swatch of our side seam of our bather bottoms, and I'm going to show you how to sew these with the sewing machine. So I'm going to have the side of the foot lined up with my side seam. So that's going to give us about a 1/2 centimeter seam allowance. And then I've set my zigzag stitch to approximately 3 in width and 1.5 in stitch length. So you want it quite a close stitch length. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my side seam. Taking the pins out as I go. Don't forget to do a little back tack at the end. About 4 stitches. I'm winding my foot up to the top when I take it out. Now, this is a nice tight and fairly narrow zigzag, and as you can see, it's giving it a lot of stretch. So this isn't going to hold you back from stretch sewing if you only have a sewing machine.
Okay, so now I'm going to sew up my bather bottoms. I've got them pinned together, lots of pins on the sides here and at the crotch. So that's where I'm going to start. I've got the foot of the machine raised, I've got the needles raised, and then I'm just going to gently slide my garment in there, gently put the foot down, and I like to have my needles down inside the fabric, and that holds it all nice and secure. And now I'm going to sew it up. And your machine should have a little thread cutter just here, and then you can cut your threads. All right, next seam. All right, last side. Taking your pins out as you go along. I should really have a pin cushion here, but I don't. Okay. And now we're all sewn together. Next for the waistband. Okay, so now I'm about to sew my waistband. I've just popped a pin here at the back seam. I'm going to sew this seam first, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the waistband perfectly in half, and I'm going to sew it up like a tube. Now, I recommend doing this for beginners because when it's actually stitched together in half like that, it's going to be a lot easier for you to attach it to your garment. Okay, so first up, I'm going to sew this little seam. Now, make sure when you sew into a tube that you put your seam internally. Now, you can gently ease the fabric through the machine, making sure that your seams are lined up as you sew, but if you feel more confident, you can also put a few pins in. It's really important to remember when you're sewing not to stretch the fabric right now. Just gently feed it through. Go in little short bursts if you need to, and just maintain one hand here, making sure that it doesn't twist. That's my waistband sewn, and now what I'm ready to do is to pin it onto the bather bottoms, and I'll show you the next step. All right, so now we're going to match up all our seams. So we're going to start with the back, and what we do is we find our back seam of our waistband and we're going to pin right sides together. So we're going to match up that seam with my little notch that I now know is the back. Now, the reason that we do this quartering technique is to make sure that we perfectly disperse the stretch evenly around the circumference of the waistband. So when you sew it on, it's stretched evenly around the body. So now I'm going to pin everything on. Okay, so I've done my back, and now I'm going to bring this round to the side. So I've got my pin here indicating the side, and I know that my side seam is where the two colors. This is also why when you're doing beginning sewing, it's also really fun to do it with a whole bunch of different colored lycra. It's also really helpful to see all the markings. Then thread that through, and then I know that this is my front, and I found my little notch at the pink. So I'm going to bring that and pin that in place. And then I know, bring this round to my other side, transfer the pin, and then you'll see that when it's held loose, it kind of looks like it doesn't fit, but then when you stretch it out, you see that it fits perfectly, and you know that when it's sewn on, it's going to fit perfectly. And now I'll show you how to sew it on. Okay, so now I'm ready to sew my waistband onto my bather bottoms. I've got everything pinned on in place. I've done the quartering technique, so I know that everything is evenly dispersed. And what I'm doing is I always start at the center back. And I start at the center back, so I know that I'm traveling all the way around the garment and evenly dispersing the stretch. Now, when you're sewing, you're making sure that you are lightly easing, stretching the waistband around to the next quarter mark from seam to seam. It's very important that you don't stretch both of the things. You don't stretch the bather bottoms, you just stretch the waistband. You're stretching it on. So just use this hand to hold the garment in place and this hand to stretch, and just go slow. Okay, another little great sewing stretch tip is that once you finish sewing your seam, your overlocking thread will hang over here. And then what you want to do is you want to cut it 1 centimeter away from the fabric. Then carefully just get each individual little thread like this and pull them, it's tricky, to lock them off. And what that'll do is it'll create a little knot and just lock off the threads to secure that your threads will never unravel. Then grab your scissors and just snip your long tails.
Okay, so we're back on the sewing machine now, and I'm going to show you a really cool handy technique to do the leg bands using some 5mm elastic. This is a really useful technique for dance or activewear, and it can be great for armholes, necklines, or leg bands. So first I'm going to halve my piece of elastic. This was cut to length from my pattern, and it's usually about that much shorter than your actual leg circumference. I'm going to pop a little pin at the halfway point, and I'm going to match that up to my side seam. Now I'm laying this flush on the inside of the garment, and I'm laying the side seam flat, and I'm going to pin that on just on the edge of the fabric. Then I'm going to stretch back to the crutch seam, which I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lay it flat facing backwards, and I'm going to place it in ready to sew. I'm going to have a wide zigzag width, so I'm going to have it about 4, and I want it quite a long length, stitch length, so I'm going to have the stitch length at 4 as well. So what that means is it's going to be nice and tight, nice and loose, sorry, as I stretch the elastic on. And then I'm going to start sewing. So I've eased my elastic onto each leg of the bather bottoms. So I'm going to turn them the right side, and you can see my contrasting black stitching. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the elastic back onto itself. So I'm going to take the elastic sitting flat, and I'm just going to fold it over so the elastic creates a nice sharp edge. And starting on at the crutch seam, I'm just going to sew around, turning the elastic in to the inside of the fabric and the inside of the garment so that we have a nice smooth finished leg band. All right, so I've finished sewing the top stitch of my elastic for the leg bands now, which means our bather bottoms are finished. Trim our little excess thread off. So we've got the front and the back, and I really love the exposed stitching and that elastic technique. And now we can wear them to the pool.
Thanks for joining us for this Stretch Basics Craft Club. We hope we've equipped you with all the tools you may need to make your own fabulous fashions and costumes out of stretch fabric. See you next time!